January 17, 1940. A military lodging house in Koblenz, Germany. The room is sparse, heated inadequately against the bitter winter cold. Sitting at a small desk, surrounded by maps and operational reports, is General der Infantry Erich von Manstein, recently appointed Chief of Staff to General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A. He is 52 years old, considered one of the finest operational minds in the Heer, the German army. But he is frustrated, sidelined, and deeply troubled. On his desk lies the official German war plan for the invasion of France and the Low Countries, codenamed Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. It is, in essence, a rehash of the old Schlieffen Plan from 1914, a massive right-wing wheel through Belgium and Holland, with the strongest force, Army Group B under Fedor von Bock, delivering the main blow. The goal is to defeat the Allied armies in Belgium and seize the Channel ports. To Manstein, a veteran of the Great War's brutal stalemate, this plan is not just uninspired, it is dangerously predictable. It plays directly into Allied expectations. The French and British High Command, believing the Ardennes forest to be impenetrable to a large modern army, have massed their best mobile forces, the French Armée de Métier and the British Expeditionary Force, precisely to rush into Belgium and meet the German onslaught head-on. Manstein sees it clearly. Fall Gelb would result in a titanic, head-on collision in central Belgium. Victory would be costly and indecisive, likely bogging Germany down in another protracted war of attrition on two fronts, the very scenario that had doomed the Kaiser's empire. In the context of a global World War II that Germany had initiated but not yet fully defined, this was a potential recipe for strategic disaster. As he studies the maps, his focus is drawn to a region everyone else has dismissed, the Ardennes. This densely forested, hilly region of southeastern Belgium and Luxembourg was considered poor tank country by both German and Allied planners. The roads were narrow and winding, the terrain broken. Conventional military wisdom held that large mechanized formations could not pass through it quickly. But Manstein, thinking with what he called Fingerspitzengefühl, an intuitive fingertip feeling for operations, saw opportunity in this perceived obstacle. What if the Allies' greatest strength, their forward concentration in Belgium, could be turned into their greatest weakness? What if the main German assault was not a right hook, but a lethal left jab through the impenetrable Ardennes? His mind began to weave a new plan, one of staggering audacity. The existing plan called for the Schwerpunkt, the main point of effort, to be with Army Group B in the north. Manstein's radical proposal was to shift the Schwerpunkt south to Rundstedt's Army Group A. This weaker army group would be massively reinforced with the bulk of Germany's precious panzer divisions, organized into a single, powerful armored spearhead. This panzer group would not amble through the Ardennes, it would race through it, achieving strategic surprise. Its objective would not be to engage the Allied armies in Belgium, but to bypass them entirely. It would cross the Meuse River at Sedan, the weakest point in the French defensive line, and then execute a lightning wheel to the northwest, driving straight for the English Channel. This sweeping, scythe-like maneuver, the Sichelschnitt, would slice behind the entire mass of the Allied mobile forces now advanced into Belgium. In one stroke, it would cut their lines of communication, sever them from their bases in France, and trap them in a gigantic pocket against the sea. The campaign would not be a battle of annihilation against the enemy army. It would be a battle of paralysis against its command structure and logistics. It was a plan that traded the certainty of a bloody frontal battle for the gamble of a deep, vulnerable, but potentially war-winning thrust. February 7, 1940, the Bendler Block, Army High Command, OKH, Berlin. Manstein had been quietly, persistently advocating for his plan for weeks, sending memoranda to the Army High Command under General Walther Brauchitsch and Chief of Staff Franz Halder. The reaction from the traditionalist OKH was one of hostility and alarm. The plan was deemed a fantasy, dangerous, and an unnecessary risk. The senior command was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of committing the entire panzer force to a single vulnerable thrust through difficult terrain. They feared the spearhead could be cut off and destroyed. There were also elements of institutional inertia and personal pique. Halder, in particular, saw the pushy Manstein as a threat. To silence him, the OKH resorted to a classic bureaucratic maneuver. They removed him from his influential staff post. On February 7th, Manstein was notified he was being transferred to command the 38th Army Corps, a formation currently being formed in Stettin, far from the Western Front. It was a clear attempt to exile him and his disruptive ideas. However, Manstein had secured one final crucial audience before his departure. A group of younger, tank-minded officers from his staff, including the influential Colonel Gunther Blumtetrit, arranged for Manstein to brief the commanders of the very panzer divisions his plan relied on. This private briefing, held on February 7th, was a revelation. The panzer commanders, men like Heinz Guderian, a visionary of armored warfare himself, and Erwin Rommel, listened with electrified attention. They immediately grasped the plan's operational genius. It was the ultimate expression of the Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement, they championed. Guderian, the most respected panzer leader, assured Manstein that the Ardennes were passable for his tanks, provided the operation was executed with speed and air support. This clandestine meeting created a powerful lobby for the plan within the Army's most dynamic branch. The idea could no longer simply be buried by paperwork. February 17, 1940, the Reich Chancellery, Berlin. Fate intervened through a combination of staff officers' networking and Hitler's own restless, intuitive military mind. Hitler, who fancied himself a strategic genius, had always been uneasy with the orthodox Fall-Gelb. He sensed it lacked a knockout blow. Through his own military liaison officer, he heard whispers of Manstein's dismissed alternative. Intrigued, he ordered Manstein to report to him in Berlin for a personal briefing. On the morning of February 17th, the exiled general stood before the Führer and his inner circle. For over an hour, Manstein laid out the Sichelschnitt plan with crisp, logical clarity. He explained the predictability of the old plan, the Allied disposition, and the war-winning potential of a surprise thrust through Sedan. Hitler, who instinctively favored bold, unconventional solutions, was captivated. Here was a plan that matched his own appetite for risk and his desire for a swift, dramatic victory. He saw in it the opportunity for a historic triumph that would dwarf the conquest of Poland. During the meeting, Hitler reportedly exclaimed, "This is exactly what I have been looking for." This personal endorsement from the Supreme Commander was the death knell for the old Fall-Gelb. Over the following weeks, under intense pressure from Hitler, a furious and resentful General Halder and the OKH staff were forced to scrap their own plan and develop a new one based entirely on Manstein's concept. The Sichelschnitt was no longer a dissident's proposal. It was now Germany's official war plan. The forgotten general's idea, born in a Koblenz lodging house, had just been adopted as the blueprint for the conquest of Western Europe. May 10, 1940, 05:35 a.m. The German-Luxembourg border. Fall-Gelb is launched, but it is now Manstein's war. The Allies, as predicted, execute their Dial plan and rush their best forces north into Belgium to meet the expected German main attack, which is feigned by Army Group B with paratroopers and aggressive reconnaissance. Meanwhile, through the quiet dawn mists of the Ardennes, the true Schwerpunkt begins to move. A colossal armored column, the Panzergruppe under General Ewald von Kleist, snakes along the narrow, winding roads. It is over 150 miles long, a traffic jam of tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and artillery. For 3 days, this immense force moves through the forest, shielded from aerial detection by the thick canopy and by the Luftwaffe's command of the skies. The French cavalry screen in the Ardennes is brushed aside. The critical moment comes on May 13 at Sedan. Here, the Meuse River is the last major natural barrier before the open French plains. The French High Command believes it will take days for the Germans to bring up heavy artillery to force a crossing. But Manstein's plan, executed by Guderian, employs a devastating innovation: the integrated use of air power as flying artillery. For 8 hours, waves of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers scream down on the French bunkers and gun positions on the far bank in a display of pinpoint, terror-inducing bombardment. Under this cover, German assault engineers cross in rubber boats, establishing bridgeheads. By nightfall, the first panzers are crossing on hastily erected pontoon bridges. The French defensive line, manned by second-rate, demoralized divisions, cracks with shocking speed. The impenetrable Ardennes and the formidable Meuse have been conquered in less than 4 days. What follows is the Sichelschnitt in motion, a maneuver that would become the archetype of blitzkrieg. Instead of turning southeast to threaten Paris, as the terrified French High Command expects, Guderian's and Rommel's panzer divisions pivot northwest. They race across the open country of northern France, a panzer corridor driving like a steel wedge between the Allied armies in Belgium and the rest of France. Their orders are simple: drive for the Channel, don't stop for flank security. The speed is disorienting and paralyzing. French and British commanders, their communications in chaos, cannot grasp the scale or direction of the threat. By May 20th, just 10 days after the offensive began, advance elements of the 2nd Panzer Division reach the coast at Abbeville. The Sichelschnitt is complete. The entire British Expeditionary Force, the Belgian Army, and the cream of the French Army, over 1 million men, are trapped in a giant pocket pressed against the sea at Dunkirk. Manstein's operational vision has been executed with near-perfect precision. The campaign in the West has been decided in less than 2 weeks. The world is stunned. Here lies the heart of the almost. The operational plan succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But its strategic culmination was thwarted by a decision that remains one of the great controversies of World War II: the halt order at Dunkirk. Between May 24th and 26th, with the panzers poised to crush the encircled Allies against the coast, Hitler, influenced by Göring's promises that the Luftwaffe could destroy the pocket, and nervous Army High Command concerns about overextension and a potential French counterattack from the south, ordered the panzer divisions to stop. This fatal pause allowed the British to organize the miraculous evacuation of over 338,000 troops from Dunkirk's beaches. Manstein's plan had achieved a Cannae-like encirclement, but the final act of annihilation was denied. This moment represents the almost changed the entire course of our story. Had the Panzers been allowed to advance, had the BEF been captured or destroyed on the beaches, the consequences would have been profound. The British Army would have been eradicated, losing its entire professional corps. The political will in London to continue the war, even under Churchill, would have been subjected to an almost unbearable strain. A negotiated peace with a triumphant Germany, leaving Hitler dominant on the continent, becomes a terrifyingly plausible possibility. With the Western Front secure, Germany could have turned the full, undivided might of the Wehrmacht against the Soviet Union in 1941, potentially with greater strength and without the looming threat of a second front. The entire strategic architecture of World War II would have been fundamentally altered. The story of Manstein and the Sichelschnitt is ultimately a story about the power of an idea. It demonstrates how the course of global conflict can hinge on the determined advocacy of a single, insightful individual fighting against a monolithic bureaucracy. It shows how a correct solution, arrived at through rigorous military thought, can be initially rejected by the institution it is meant to save. And it highlights the razor-thin line between total victory and a compromised, though still decisive, success.
Manstein's secret plan did not just almost change World War II. For a few catastrophic weeks in the spring of 1940, it was World War II in the West, a whirlwind of steel and fire unleashed from a map in a quiet room, a testament to the terrifying power of a brilliant mind when granted the chance to shape history. To understand why Sicherschnitt was so revolutionary and why it almost altered the war, we must dissect its components and contrast them with the strategic jailbreak of 1914 and 1918 that haunted all European generals. The old Fall Gelb was a linear plan. It envisioned a set-piece battle along a predictable axis, seeking to defeat the enemy's army in the field through superior force at the point of contact. It was a plan of brute force and frontal assault, updated with tanks but not transformed by them. Manstein's genius was to think non-linearly. He was not planning a battle, he was planning a systemic collapse. His plan targeted the enemy's not physical strength, but its nervous system, its command, control, and logistical lines. The Sicherschnitt was a deep operation before the term was formally coined, an act of strategic jujitsu that used the enemy's own strength and plans against them.
The plan's success rested on four interlocking pillars, each a radical departure from orthodoxy. First, psychological shock and surprise. By sending the main assault through the Ardennes, Manstein exploited a deeply ingrained Allied bias. French and British military doctrine, rooted in the static warfare of the Great War, could not conceive of a major mechanized force moving through such terrain. This wasn't just a tactical feint, it was a fundamental exploitation of cognitive blindness. The surprise was so complete that even as reports of German tanks in the Ardennes filtered back, Allied high command dismissed them as reconnaissance or secondary efforts. The Schwerpunkt was where they least expected it. Second, unprecedented speed and tempo. Manstein's plan demanded not just movement, but relentless, unsustainable velocity. The panzers were not to stop to consolidate or protect flanks. This created what military theorists call an operational shock, where the speed of events outruns the enemy's ability to process information and react. French command structures, hierarchical and deliberate, were paralyzed by the blitzkrieg tempo. Orders were issued for situations that had ceased to exist hours before. Third, concentration of force. While the old plan diluted Germany's armored strength across multiple armies, Manstein advocated for the massing of virtually every available panzer division into a single, irresistible spearhead. This concentration at the decisive point gave the Ardennes thrust a kinetic power the dispersed French defenses could not withstand, especially at a soft spot like Sedan, held by lower-quality divisions. Fourth, decisive aim. The objective was not territory, but the enemy's strategic cohesion. The drive to the Channel was a masterstroke of operational design. It turned the entire theater of war into a single unified problem. Every Allied soldier north of the Panzer Corridor was instantly rendered strategically irrelevant, cut off and doomed unless rescued. This clarity of purpose was transmitted down to the lowest panzer commander, creating a shared understanding that fueled the audacious drive. The staggering success of May 1940, built on Manstein's rejected plan, created profound and lasting fractures within the German officer corps. The victory was a double-edged sword for the traditionalist general staff, OKH, under Halder and Brauchitsch. While they basked in the glory of the triumph, they were privately humiliated. They had been forced by a junior officer's intellect and Hitler's intervention to adopt a plan they had scorned. This bred deep-seated resentment towards Manstein, who was seen as an upstart who had bypassed the chain of command. More dangerously, it cemented Hitler's belief in his own military infallibility. The Führer saw the victory as a vindication of his intuition over the cautious and outdated generals. This dynamic would have catastrophic consequences later in the war, particularly on the Eastern Front. When generals like Halder or later Manstein himself advised caution or strategic withdrawal at Moscow or Stalingrad, Hitler could, and did, dismiss them by recalling how they had been wrong about the Ardennes. The success of Zielkelschnitt thus poisoned civil-military relations, empowering Hitler's worst instincts and making reasoned strategic debate increasingly impossible. For Manstein personally, the outcome was bittersweet. He was awarded the Knight's Cross and promoted, but he never received the public credit as the architect of the victory. The Nazi propaganda machine attributed the success to the genius of the Führer and the dash of front-line commanders like Rommel. Manstein's role was sanitized from the official narrative. His subsequent commands on the Eastern Front, the brutal conquest of the Crimea in 1942, his masterful defensive battles and counterstrokes in 1943, further cemented his reputation as Germany's premier operational artist. Yet, he always operated within strategic parameters set by Hitler, parameters that were often disastrous. He became the brilliant technician trying to salvage the unfixable designs of a mad architect. The man who had once changed the course of the war was now powerless to stop its downward spiral. The shock of the Zielkelschnitt was perhaps the single greatest military lesson of World War II for the Western Allies. It was a traumatic, expensive, but utterly transformative education. In its aftermath, the defeated armies, particularly the British and the nascent U.S. Army, undertook a ruthless and painful period of self-examination. Every assumption was questioned. The French army, which had placed its faith in continuous linear fortifications like the Maginot Line and methodical battle, was discredited and disbanded. The British, who had escaped by a miracle, began a total overhaul. The lessons were internalized and would shape Allied doctrine for the remainder of the global conflict. Mobility and armored independence. The British formed permanent armored divisions and developed more effective tank infantry cooperation tactics. The Americans, entering the war, built a massive armored force based on the principles of deep independent operation, as seen in Patton's drives across France in August 1944. Air-ground integration. The terrifying effectiveness of the Stuka as flying artillery led to an Allied revolution in close air support. The development of forward air controllers, fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt, and sophisticated ground-air radio networks gave the Allies a tactical air advantage that would dominate the later years of the war. Intelligence and deception. The Allies learned that surprise was the ultimate force multiplier. This lesson fueled massive investments in intelligence, most famously at Bletchley Park, and in elaborate deception operations like those surrounding D-Day, Operation Fortitude, which were essentially sophisticated, large-scale applications of the Zielkelschnitt principle of misdirection, but played on a strategic, not just operational level. In a profound historical irony, the Allies, especially the U.S. Army under generals like Eisenhower and Bradley, would eventually adopt a more cautious, broad front strategy in northwestern Europe in 1944 to 1945, fearing the vulnerabilities of a single deep armored thrust. However, when they did allow for deep operations, as in Patton's race across France in August 1944, the ghost of the Zielkelschnitt was evident. More importantly, the Soviet Red Army studied the German victory in France with intense interest. Soviet marshals like Georgy Zhukov absorbed its lessons in deep penetration and the encirclement of army groups, lessons they would apply with devastating effect, and on a far grander scale, in operations like Bagration in 1944, which annihilated German Army Group Center.
The hinge of history, the moment Manstein's plan truly almost changed the entire course, remains the halt before Dunkirk. Let's explore this counterfactual in sober military terms. Had Kleist's and Guderian's panzers been unleashed on May 24, 1940, the outcome at Dunkirk would not have been an evacuation, but a surrender or a massacre. The perimeter was unstable, the troops disorganized. A coordinated armored assault, supported by the infantry divisions following close behind, would have shattered it within 48 hours. The immediate consequences are stark. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, approximately 400,000 men, including the core of the professional army, is lost. This is not just a loss of manpower, it is the destruction of the institutional knowledge, the experienced NCOs and officers, the very skeleton of the British Army. The psychological blow in Britain is incalculable. While Churchill's rhetoric was defiant, his political position was perilous. With the army gone, the threat of invasion becomes terrifyingly immediate. Lord Halifax and the peace party within the War Cabinet, who were already advocating for exploring negotiated terms through Mussolini in late May 1940, would have gained overwhelming traction. It is plausible, perhaps even probable, that Britain is forced to the negotiating table. Hitler, eager to turn east, might have offered terms, perhaps a return of pre-war German colonies, a free hand in Europe, and nominal British independence. A ceasefire, if not a formal peace, is established. This alters the fundamental geometry of World War II. No Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe is not bled white over the English Channel. No North African campaign. Rommel's Africa Corps is never sent. No Atlantic War on the current scale. The U-boat campaign continues, but without a British base for convoys and escorts, it is a different fight. No lend-lease to the USSR via the Arctic convoys. Most critically, Operation Barbarossa in 1941 is launched by a Germany unencumbered by a Western front. The entire Luftwaffe, scores of additional divisions, and vast logistical resources are available for the invasion of the Soviet Union. While the deep structural flaws of Barbarossa, the underestimation of Soviet strength, the logistical fantasy remain, the weight of force applied is significantly greater. The drive on Moscow in the autumn of 1941 might have had the extra infantry divisions to secure flanks and the extra air power to maintain air superiority. It is conceivable that key objectives like Moscow or the Caucasus oil fields are seized. This does not guarantee a German victory over the USSR. The Soviet capacity for resistance and strategic depth was immense, but it creates a scenario where a Nazi-dominated Eurasia, facing a hostile but wounded Stalinist state in the Urals and an isolated United States across the oceans, becomes a terrifying possibility. The entire moral and strategic narrative of World War II, a crusade of the Grand Alliance against fascism, collapses. Manstein's plan, in this counterfactual, becomes the single most decisive military document of the 20th century, the key that unlocked a Nazi victory. Erich von Manstein died in 1973, a controversial figure who served his post-war prison sentence for war crimes and later advised the West German Bundeswehr. History remembers him as a brilliant, if morally compartmentalized, operational commander. But his true legacy is sealed in those critical months at the dawn of World War II. The Sickle-Snit Plan stands as one of the purest examples of operational art in military history, a symphony of movement, surprise, and decisive aim that turned a potential stalemate into a historic rout. The story of this forgotten general and his secret plan is more than a thrilling tale of what might have been. It is a masterclass in the anatomy of military innovation. It demonstrates how transformative ideas face institutional hostility, how success can be hijacked by political agendas, and how the closest-run things in history depend on a cascade of decisions, from a general's stubborn advocacy to a corporal's actions on a bridge. Manstein's plan almost changed everything because it correctly identified the center of gravity in the 1940 campaign, not as the Allied army, but as its plan and its assumptions. By striking there, he didn't just win a battle, he redefined the opening act of the global conflict. While he faded into the background, the shadow of his sickle cut fell across every subsequent campaign of World War II, a haunting reminder to every general on every side that wars are won not just by force, but by the power of a better idea, conceived in secret, fought for against all odds, and executed with world-changing consequences.